Marcus Blackwood stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the dark valley below, his centuries-old eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a mountain, each memory a sharp blade cutting through his immortal heart. He had been the vampire king for over 800 years, ruling with an iron fist and commanding respect through fear. But, tonight, everything had changed. The betrayal had happened 3 nights ago, during the blood moon ceremony that occurred once every 50 years. It was the most sacred ritual among his kind, where vampire clans from across the world gathered to renew their ancient pacts. Marcus had made a decision that would haunt him for eternity. He had chosen to save a human child over protecting his own vampire subjects. Elena Rodriguez, a 7-year-old girl with bright brown eyes and an innocent smile, had wandered into the ceremonial grounds while playing near her grandmother's house in the nearby village. The child had no idea she had stumbled into a gathering of the most dangerous creatures on Earth. According to vampire law, any human who witnessed their sacred rituals must be eliminated immediately to protect their secret existence. But, when Marcus saw Elena standing there, trembling with fear yet showing remarkable courage, something inside him broke. For the first time in centuries, he felt something he thought had died long ago: compassion. The child reminded him of his own daughter, Isabella, who had died of plague over 900 years ago when he was still human. "Kill the child," demanded Victoria Ashworth, his most trusted lieutenant and the leader of the European Coven. Her silver hair gleamed in the moonlight as her fangs extended, ready for the kill. "The law is clear, my king. No witnesses." Marcus had looked at little Elena, who was clutching a small wooden doll her grandmother had made for her. The child's heartbeat echoed in his supernatural hearing, fast and frightened, yet she stood her ground. In that moment, he made the choice that would cost him everything. "No," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "The child lives." The gathering of vampires fell silent. Never before had their king defied the ancient laws that had kept their species safe for millennia. Victoria's eyes widened in shock and anger. "You cannot be serious, Marcus. This goes against everything we stand for. Every law our ancestors died to protect." Marcus walked slowly toward Elena, his movements careful and non-threatening. He knelt down to her level, his dark eyes meeting hers. "What's your name, little one?" "Elena," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you going to hurt me?" "No, child. I'm going to make sure you get home safely to your grandmother." The vampire king turned to face his subjects, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright rebellion. These were creatures who had followed him through wars, plagues, and the rise and fall of human civilizations. They had trusted his judgment implicitly for 8 centuries. "This child has done nothing wrong," Marcus announced. "She is innocent of any crime against our kind. I will not allow her blood to be spilled on sacred ground." Thomas Harding, the leader of the American Covens, stepped forward. He was one of Marcus's oldest allies, turned during the Civil War. "My king, with respect, you're asking us to ignore laws that have protected us since the beginning of our existence. If humans discover us, then we will deal with that when it happens," Marcus interrupted. "But, tonight, this child lives." He gently took Elena's hand and began walking her toward the edge of the ceremonial grounds. Behind him, he could hear the angry murmurs of his subjects growing louder. Some were calling for his removal as king. Others were demanding that both he and the child be executed for breaking vampire law. As they walked, Elena looked up at him with curious eyes. "Why do you have such sharp teeth?" Marcus almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "They help me eat," he said simply. "My grandmother says there are monsters in the forest, but you don't seem like a monster. You're helping me." Those words hit Marcus harder than any weapon could. A monster, that's exactly what he had been for centuries. He had killed thousands, ruled through terror, and shown no mercy to those who opposed him. But this innocent child saw something different in him. When they reached the village, Marcus could see Elena's grandmother frantically searching for her with several neighbors. The old woman's relief was palpable when she saw her granddaughter approaching. "Elena! Thank God you're safe." The grandmother rushed forward and swept the child into her arms. Elena turned back to Marcus. "Thank you for helping me find my way home." Before Marcus could respond, the child and her grandmother disappeared into their small house. He stood there for a long moment, watching the warm light in their windows, remembering what it felt like to have a family, to have someone who looked at him with love instead of fear. By the time Marcus returned to the ceremonial grounds, more than half of his subjects had already left. Those who remained were the ones closest to him, but even they looked at him with disappointment and confusion. Victoria approached him, her face a mask of cold anger. "You have destroyed everything we've built, Marcus. The other covens are already talking about choosing a new king. Someone who will actually follow our laws." "Perhaps it's time," Marcus replied quietly. "Perhaps I've been king for too long. You've been our leader for 800 years. You've kept us safe, kept us hidden, kept us strong. And you're willing to throw all of that away for one human child?" Marcus looked at his lieutenant, this woman who had been by his side through countless battles and challenges. "Victoria, when was the last time you felt truly alive? Not just immortal, but alive?" She stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "We are vampires, Marcus. We are not meant to feel alive. We are meant to survive. Maybe that's where we've gone wrong." Over the next 2 days, the vampire world erupted in chaos. Covens across the globe called emergency meetings. Ancient alliances crumbled as different factions debated what should be done about their king's betrayal. Some demanded his immediate execution. Others suggested stripping him of his powers and banishing him. A few, very few, wondered if perhaps their king had seen something they had missed. The European covens, led by Victoria, declared Marcus unfit to rule. The Asian covens, always more traditional, agreed. The American covens were split, with Thomas Harding trying to maintain loyalty to Marcus while acknowledging the severity of his actions. Rebecca Stone, a vampire Marcus had turned during the American Revolution, came to see him on the second night. She had served as his advisor for over 2 centuries and was one of the few who dared to speak to him honestly. "They're planning to remove you, Marcus. Tonight." Victoria has gathered enough support from the major covens. Marcus nodded. He had expected this. "And you, Rebecca? Where do you stand?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I've watched you lead our people for centuries. I've seen you make difficult decisions, sometimes ruthless ones, always for the good of our species. But I've also watched you become harder, colder, more distant with each passing decade. What you did 3 nights ago, it was the first time in 100 years I've seen you act from your heart instead of your head. The heart is a luxury vampires cannot afford," Marcus said, echoing words he had spoken countless times over the centuries. "Is it? Or have we simply convinced ourselves of that because it's easier than facing what we've become?" Before Marcus could answer, they heard the approaching footsteps of many vampires. The confrontation was about to begin. Victoria led a group of 20 vampires into Marcus's private chambers. These were the most powerful and influential leaders from around the world. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold. "Marcus Blackwood," Victoria announced formally, "you stand accused of betraying the fundamental laws of our kind. You have endangered every vampire in existence by allowing a human witness to live. The punishment for such betrayal has always been death." Marcus stood slowly, his tall frame imposing even in defeat. "I do not deny the charges." "Then, you accept the consequences?" Marcus thought of Elena, safely asleep in her grandmother's house. He thought of his own daughter, Isabella, who had died so long ago. He thought of the thousands of humans he had killed over the centuries, each one someone's child, someone's beloved family member. "I accept that my actions have consequences. But I do not accept that showing mercy is a betrayal." Thomas Harding stepped forward. "Marcus, we've been allies for over a century. I'm giving you one chance to make this right. Order the death of the child, and we can move past this." "No." The single word rang out in the silence like a bell. There was no hesitation, no doubt in Marcus's voice. Victoria's eyes flashed with anger. then you leave us no choice. But, before anyone could move, a young vampire named David Chen, who had been turned only 50 years ago, spoke up. Wait. What if our king is right? The room fell silent. No one had expected this. David continued, his voice gaining strength. For 1,000 years, we've lived in hiding, feeding off humans like parasites, ruling through fear. What has it gotten us? We're no closer to finding peace or purpose. We're just existing. Maybe it's time we tried a different path. Silence. Victoria snapped. You're barely a century old. You know nothing of our struggles, nothing of what it takes to keep our kind safe. I know that I've never felt more empty than I have since becoming a vampire, David replied. And I know that what our king did 3 nights ago was the first truly noble thing I've witnessed in my 50 years of immortal life. Several other young vampires nodded in agreement. Marcus watched with growing amazement as his subjects began to divide into 2 camps, those who supported the old ways and those who wondered if change might be possible. But Victoria had heard enough. This ends now, she declared, her fangs extending as she prepared to attack Marcus. The vampire king made no move to defend himself. If his death would protect Elena and, perhaps inspire some of his kind to find a better way, then, perhaps it would be worth it. But, as Victoria lunged forward, Rebecca Stone stepped between them. If you want to kill our king, you'll have to go through me first. One by one, other vampires joined Rebecca, forming a protective circle around Marcus. To his surprise, it wasn't just the young ones. Some of his oldest allies, vampires who had served him for centuries, chose to stand with him. Thomas Harding looked torn, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he stepped forward, but, instead of joining either side, he spoke to the room. We are tearing ourselves apart over the actions of one night. Perhaps we should take time to truly consider what our king's choice means. I propose we give Marcus 1 year to prove that his path can work without destroying us all. Victoria whirled on Thomas. A year? You want to risk the exposure of our entire species for a year-long experiment? I want to avoid a civil war that will definitely destroy us, Thomas replied. 1 year. If Marcus can show us that mercy and compassion can coexist with our survival, then, perhaps we learn something. If he fails, if his actions lead to our exposure or destruction, then, we handle this permanently. The room erupted in arguments. Some vampires supported Thomas's proposal, others demanded immediate action. But, gradually, a consensus began to emerge. 1 year. Marcus would have 1 year to prove that a vampire could show mercy without dooming his entire species. As the other vampires filed out, still arguing among themselves, Victoria approached Marcus one last time. You have condemned us all, she said quietly. And, when this year is over, when your foolish compassion has led to our destruction, I will be the one to end you myself. Marcus met her gaze steadily. If I am wrong, Victoria, then, I will welcome that ending. After everyone had left, Marcus stood alone in his chambers, the weight of 8 centuries of kingship suddenly, feeling heavier than ever. He had 1 year to prove that a vampire could change, could be something more than a monster. 1 year to find redemption for centuries of darkness. He walked to his window and looked out toward the village where Elena slept peacefully, unaware that her life had started a revolution in the vampire world. For the first time in centuries, Marcus Blackwood felt something he had almost forgotten, hope. But, he also felt something else, the crushing responsibility of proving that even monsters could find redemption. The next year would test everything he believed about himself and his kind. And, if he failed, the consequences would be far worse than his own death. The Vampire King's journey toward redemption was about to begin, but the path ahead was darker and more dangerous than anything he had faced in 800 years of immortal existence. 6 months had passed since Marcus Blackwood made the decision that shattered his world. The Vampire King who once ruled from a Gothic castle now lived in a simple cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, far from any human settlement. His magnificent throne room had been replaced by a single room with basic furniture and walls lined with books he had collected over the centuries. The year of proving himself was not going as Marcus had hoped. 3 vampire covens had already been exposed to human authorities because younger vampires, inspired by his act of mercy, had become careless. In Romania, a newly turned vampire named Peter Volkov had saved a human family from a house fire, but his supernatural speed had been caught on security cameras. In Japan, a vampire named Yuki Tanaka had intervened to stop a human trafficking ring, but left too much evidence of her inhuman strength. Each incident sent shockwaves through the vampire community and brought Victoria Ashworth one step closer to gathering enough support to end Marcus's experiment permanently. Marcus sat at his wooden desk, reading reports that Rebecca Stone brought him weekly. The news was rarely good. The Vampire Council, which had never formally existed before but had emerged from the chaos of his decision, was meeting again in Vienna. Victoria now led this council, and her influence grew stronger with each passing month. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see Elena Rodriguez standing on his porch, now 8 years old and noticeably taller than when they first met. Her grandmother, Isabella Rodriguez, stood behind her, looking nervous but determined. "Hello, Mr. Marcus," Elena said with a bright smile. "Grandma says we need to talk to you." Marcus's dead heart seemed to skip a beat. In all his centuries of existence, he had never expected the child he saved to seek him out. He quickly opened the door, his enhanced hearing already picking up the sound of a car driving away down the mountain road. "Elena, how did you find me? How did you get here?" Isabella Rodriguez stepped forward. She was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded Marcus painfully of his own mother from centuries ago. "My granddaughter has been having dreams, Mr. Blackwood. Dreams about you. She insisted we come." Marcus invited them inside, his mind racing. Vampires couldn't be tracked through dreams, and humans certainly couldn't locate them supernaturally. This was something entirely new. Elena made herself comfortable in his simple living room, looking around with curiosity rather than fear. "You have so many books. Do you read all of them?" "I've had a lot of time to read," Marcus said carefully. "Elena, tell me about these dreams." The little girl's expression became serious, far too serious for someone her age. "I see you helping people, but you're very sad. And there are others like you who are angry about it. They want to hurt you." Marcus exchanged a glance with Isabella, who looked as surprised as he felt. "There's more," Elena continued. "I dream about a lady with silver hair who wants to kill you. And I see fire, lots of fire. People running and screaming. Victoria." The child was somehow seeing Victoria Ashworth in her dreams, and apparently glimpsing possible futures. Marcus had heard legends of humans with supernatural sensitivity, but he had never encountered one. Isabella sat down beside her granddaughter. "Elena started having these dreams a month ago. She kept saying we needed to find the man with the kind eyes who saved her. I thought it was just a child's imagination until she started describing things she couldn't possibly know." "What kind of things?" "She drew a picture of a woman who perfectly matched someone I saw on the news," Isabella explained. "A European businesswoman who was supposed to be in meetings in Geneva, but Elena said she was actually in New York. I looked it up, the woman had secretly flown to New York for private meetings that weren't announced until days later." Marcus studied Elena carefully. The child was looking at him with those same brave, innocent eyes from 6 months ago, but now there was something else there, a depth of understanding that no 8-year-old should possess. "Elena, in your dreams, what happens with the fire?" "Bad things," she whispered. "People like you fighting each other. Humans getting hurt because they're caught in the middle. Whole cities burning." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "But it doesn't have to happen. I see other paths too, where everyone is safe." Marcus felt a chill run through his immortal body. If this child truly had the gift of foresight, then the vampire world was in more danger than he had realized. "Why did you come here, Elena? What do you think I can do?" The little girl stood up and walked to him, placing her small hand on his large one. The moment their skin touched, Marcus experienced something extraordinary, a flash of vision, showing him scenes of possible futures. He saw himself standing before the Vampire Council in chains. He saw Victoria leading an army of traditional vampires in a war against those who supported change. He saw human cities in flames as the conflict spilled over into the mortal world. But he also saw other possibilities: vampires and humans working together, his kind using their abilities to heal rather than harm, a world where both species could coexist openly. The vision ended, leaving Marcus breathless and shaken. Elena smiled up at him. "You see it too now, don't you? That's why I had to find you. You're the only one who can choose which future happens." Over the next hour, Elena shared more of her visions while her grandmother listened with growing amazement and concern. The child described vampire gatherings she had never seen, named vampires she had never met, and provided details about the supernatural world that should have been impossible for her to know. Most importantly, she revealed that Victoria's plan was more advanced than Marcus had realized. The European vampire was not just gathering support to remove him from power, she was preparing for what she called the Great Cleansing, a systematic elimination of any vampire who showed sympathy for humans, followed by an expansion of vampire control over human governments. She believes vampires should rule humans openly, Elena explained. She thinks hiding is weakness. In my dreams, I see her turning world leaders into vampires, creating an empire where humans are just food and servants. Marcus realized that his act of mercy had done more than break vampire law. It had accelerated a conflict that had been brewing for centuries between vampires who saw humans as prey and those who retained some connection to their former humanity. "What can I do?" Marcus asked. "I'm just one vampire. Most of my kind now see me as a traitor." "You have friends you don't know about yet," Elena said. "And you have something Victoria doesn't." "What's that?" "Hope. She's been a vampire for so long, she's forgotten what it feels like to care about anything except power." "But you remembered. That night you saved me, you remembered what it was like to be good." Isabella had been quiet through most of this conversation, but now she spoke up. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't pretend to understand what my granddaughter is talking about when she mentions vampires and supernatural things. But I know evil when I see it, and I know good when I see it. Whatever you are, you chose to protect a child when you could have hurt her. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Marcus looked at this elderly human woman with wonder. She was sitting in the home of a creature who could kill her without effort, calmly discussing the supernatural as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're not afraid of me?" Isabella smiled. "Mr. Blackwood, I'd buried 3 husbands, survived 2 wars, and raised 6 children mostly on my own. It takes a lot more than sharp teeth to frighten me at my age." Elena giggled at her grandmother's response, and, for a moment, Marcus's cabin felt warm and alive in a way it hadn't in centuries. But the moment was interrupted by a sound that made Marcus freeze: the approaching footsteps of multiple vampires. His enhanced hearing picked up at least 6 distinct heartbeats, all moving with the deliberate pace of predators who knew their prey was trapped. "Elena, Isabella, you need to hide," Marcus said urgently. "Now." But Elena shook her head. "They're not here to hurt me, Mr. Marcus. They're here to help you." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, 6 vampires appeared at his door. But, instead of Victoria's forces, these were vampires Marcus recognized as supporters: Rebecca Stone, Thomas Harding, David Chen, and 3 others from various covens around the world. Rebecca entered first, her expression grim. "Marcus, we need to leave. Now. Victoria knows about this place, and she's coming with a kill squad." Thomas looked surprised to see the humans. "Who are they?" "The child I saved," Marcus explained quickly. "And her grandmother." "Elena, how did you know they were coming to help?" "Same way I knew everything else," Elena said matter-of-factly. "I saw it in my dreams." David Chen stared at the little girl in amazement. "She's a seer. A true human seer. Marcus, do you realize how rare this is? How powerful? Powerful enough to tip the balance in our favor," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a vampire Marcus hadn't seen in over a century: Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had been turned during her service as a nurse in World War I. She had spent the last 100 years working secretly in human hospitals, using her vampiric abilities to save lives rather than take them. Sarah? What are you doing here? Same thing as the others, she replied. Fighting for the right of our kind to choose compassion over cruelty. She looked at Elena with professional curiosity. And if this child is truly a seer, she may be the key to proving that vampires and humans can coexist. Rebecca stepped forward urgently. We can discuss this later. Right now, we need to move. Victoria's forces are less than an hour away, and they're not coming to talk. As the vampires prepared to leave, Elena tugged on Marcus's jacket. Mr. Marcus, in my dreams, running away doesn't work. The bad future still happens if you run. What do you suggest? Marcus asked. Elena looked older than her 8 years as she answered. We go to them instead. All the vampires who want to change need to gather in one place. Make Victoria come to us, where we choose the ground for the fight. Thomas shook his head. That's suicide. We're outnumbered at least 3-1. Not if we're fighting for something bigger than just survival, Elena said. Mr. Marcus, in the good futures I see, you're not fighting against the old vampires. You're fighting for all the humans and vampires who want to live together in peace. Marcus looked around at his allies, these vampires who had risked everything to support his choice for mercy. Then, he looked at Elena and Isabella, 2 humans who had sought him out to offer their help despite the danger. Where, he asked Elena. If we're going to make a stand, where do we do it? Elena closed her eyes for a moment, as if consulting her inner visions. When she opened them, she smiled. There's a place where the old magic is strongest, where the first vampires made their covenant with the darkness. If you're going to change what vampires are, you need to do it there. The Carpathian Mountains, Sarah whispered. The original vampire homeland in Romania. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Elena was suggesting they return to the very place where vampire civilization had begun, where the ancient laws that governed his kind had first been written. It was either the perfect place for rebirth or the ideal location for their complete destruction. How long do we have? Marcus asked Rebecca. If we leave now and gather our allies along the way, we might have 2 weeks before Victoria realizes where we're going and follows us there. Marcus looked at Elena one more time. Are you certain about this path? In your visions, do we succeed? Elena's expression grew sad. I see many possible futures, Mr. Marcus. In some, everyone lives and the world becomes beautiful. In others. She trailed off, unable to finish. In others? In others, almost everyone dies, but the few who survive build something better for their children. The weight of that revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Marcus was asking his allies to risk everything, their lives, their existence, the future of both vampires and humans, on the hope that change was possible. Isabella stood up and took her granddaughter's hand. We're going with you. Absolutely not, Marcus said immediately. This is going to be a war zone. This is our world too, Isabella replied firmly. And Elena's visions are the only advantage you have. Where she goes, I go. Elena nodded gravely. Besides, in all the good futures, Grandma and I are there with you. We're part of what makes it work. Marcus looked around at his allies, these vampires who had chosen hope over fear, change over tradition. Then, he looked at the 2 humans who had somehow become central to determining the fate of both species. Then, we go to Romania, he said finally. We make our stand where it all began. And we pray that mercy and compassion are stronger than centuries of darkness and fear. As they prepared to leave, Elena approached Marcus one more time. Mr. Marcus, can I ask you something? Of course. In your heart, do you believe vampires can change? Really change? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question that would determine everything. Finally, he knelt down to Elena's level and looked into her wise, innocent eyes. 6 months ago, I would have said no. But, meeting you, seeing your grandmother's courage, watching vampires like David and Sarah choose love over power, yes, Elena. I believe we can change. The question is whether we'll survive the process." Elena smiled and hugged him, and, for the first time in centuries, Marcus Blackwood felt like he might actually deserve redemption. But, as they left the cabin and began their journey toward what would either be their salvation or destruction, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles still lay ahead. Victoria Ashworth was not just fighting to maintain vampire law, she was fighting to preserve a way of life that had sustained their kind for millennia. And she would not give up without a war that could consume everything they both held dear. The ancient Carpathian fortress had been abandoned for 3 centuries, but it remembered the blood that had once flowed through its stone corridors. Marcus Blackwood stood in the great hall where the first vampire council had met over 1,000 years ago, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him like a physical force. 2 weeks had passed since he left Montana with his small band of allies. Now, nearly 200 vampires filled the crumbling fortress, far more than Marcus had dared hope for, yet still vastly outnumbered by Victoria Ashworth's forces gathering in the valleys below. Elena Rodriguez sat on the ancient throne where vampire kings had once ruled, her small legs dangling over the edge while she drew pictures of her visions. Her grandmother Isabella had taken charge of coordinating the human volunteers who had somehow learned of their gathering and come to help former victims of vampire attacks who chose forgiveness over revenge, researchers who had studied the supernatural, and ordinary people who believed in the possibility of change. "The scouts report Victoria's army will reach us by tomorrow night," Rebecca Stone informed Marcus. She looked exhausted, having spent weeks traveling to gather their allies. "Marcus, I need to be honest with you. We have maybe 200 vampires. She has over 600, including some of the oldest and most powerful vampires in existence." Marcus nodded grimly. He had expected this. Victoria had had centuries to build alliances and inspire loyalty among traditional vampires. His rebellion was barely a year old. "It's not just the numbers," Thomas Harding added. He had arrived 3 days earlier with a group of American vampires, many of whom were having second thoughts now that they faced the reality of war. "Victoria has convinced most of our kind that you're not just breaking vampire law, you're threatening our very survival as a species." Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached them, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. She had been treating both vampire and human wounded from skirmishes throughout their journey. "I've been thinking about what Elena said, about this being where vampire civilization began. Maybe that's more important than we realized." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. Sarah gestured toward the ancient carvings on the walls, depicting the first vampires and their covenant with dark forces. According to legend, the first vampires made their pact with darkness in this very hall. They traded their humanity for immortality and power. But what if the same place could be used to make a different kind of pact? Elena looked up from her drawings. "You mean like undoing the old magic and making new magic?" "Exactly. Elena, in your visions of the good futures, what happens in this place?" Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "I see light. Lots of light, brighter than anything I've ever seen. And I see the darkness that's been inside vampires for so long finally going away. But..." She hesitated. "But what?" Marcus asked gently. "Someone has to choose to give up everything to make it happen. Someone has to sacrifice themselves to break the old covenant and make a new one." A chill fell over the group. Marcus felt the weight of Elena's words, understanding instinctively that she was talking about him. The vampire king who had started this revolution would have to pay the ultimate price to complete it. "There might be another way," said a voice from the entrance to the hall. Everyone turned to see David Chen entering with a vampire none of them recognized, an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes who moved with the careful dignity of great age. "This is Professor Michael O'Brien," David announced. "He's been studying vampire lore for over 2 centuries. I found him in a monastery in Tibet, where he's been researching alternatives to our traditional existence." Professor O'Brien bowed respectfully to Marcus. "Your Majesty, I've spent 200 years looking for ways vampires might evolve beyond our current limitations. What young Elena describes in her visions matches texts I've found from the earliest days of our kind." "What texts?" Rebecca asked. Records that suggest the original vampire transformation was not meant to be permanent, O'Brien explained. The first vampires were intended to be guardians, protectors of humanity who would use their enhanced abilities to defend against supernatural threats. But the power corrupted them, and they forgot their original purpose. Isabella Rodriguez spoke up from where she was organizing supplies. So you're saying vampires were meant to be heroes, not monsters? In the beginning, yes. The ability to live without aging, the enhanced strength and speed, the connection to supernatural forces, all of it was meant to serve humanity, not prey upon it. Elena stood up on the throne, her young voice carrying clearly through the hall. Professor O'Brien, in my dreams, I see a ceremony. Vampires standing in a circle, choosing to give up their need for blood in exchange for something else. But I can never see what that something else is. O'Brien's eyes widened. The Covenant of Light. I found references to it in manuscripts from before the Dark Ages, but I thought it was just mythology. According to legend, vampires could choose to transform again, trading their thirst for blood for the ability to sustain themselves on positive human emotions, love, hope, compassion. That's impossible, Thomas said immediately. Vampires need blood to survive. It's fundamental to our nature. Is it? Sarah asked. Marcus, when you saved Elena, how did you feel in that moment? Not physically, but emotionally. Marcus thought back to that night 6 months ago. I felt alive. More alive than I had in centuries. Like I remembered who I used to be before I became a monster. And, since then? The vampires who have joined us, how do they sustain themselves differently? Marcus realized what she was getting at. Many of the vampires who had joined his cause had indeed changed their feeding habits. Instead of killing, they fed minimally from willing donors. Some, like Sarah, had found that helping humans actually seemed to sustain them in ways that traditional feeding never had. Elena clapped her hands excitedly. That's it. That's what I see in the good futures. Vampires who protect people instead of hurting them, who make humans feel safe and loved instead of afraid. And, somehow, that love feeds them better than blood ever did. Professor O'Brien nodded eagerly. The texts describe the ceremony, but it requires 3 things: the willing participation of vampires ready to change, the presence of humans who choose to trust them despite centuries of fear, and... He paused. And, what? Marcus asked. A sacrifice. Someone with the power to break the original covenant must give up that power willingly. In the old texts, it was always a vampire king who had to make this choice. The hall fell silent as everyone realized what this meant. Marcus would not just have to risk his life in battle against victorious forces, he would have to sacrifice his immortality, his supernatural power, everything that made him a vampire king. If I do this, Marcus said slowly, what happens to me? According to the texts, you would become human again. Mortal. You would age and, eventually die like any normal man. Marcus looked around at the vampires who had followed him, then, at the humans who had chosen to trust him. Finally, his gaze settled on Elena, this extraordinary child who had shown him that redemption was possible. And the others? The vampires who participate in the ceremony? They would become something new. Still immortal, still enhanced, but sustained by positive connection with humanity instead of feeding on it. They would become what vampires were originally meant to be: protectors, guardians, bridges between the human and supernatural worlds. Elena jumped down from the throne and ran to Marcus. Mr. Marcus, you don't have to decide right now. First we have to survive tomorrow night. She was right. Victoria's army was approaching, and they still had a war to fight before any ceremonies could take place. But Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: genuine hope for the future. The next day passed in frantic preparation. Vampires who had never worked alongside humans found themselves learning from people they had once considered nothing more than prey. Humans who had feared the supernatural discovered that many vampires were tired of being monsters and genuinely wanted to change. Elena spent the day moving between both groups, her presence somehow calming fears and building bridges. she helped a vampire named Catherine Walsh overcome her guilt about past killings by introducing her to Maria Santos, a human whose family Catherine had once attacked but who chose to forgive. She convinced a group of skeptical humans to trust vampire allies by showing them Sarah's medical work and David's protection of vulnerable humans. As night fell, Victoria's forces surrounded the fortress. Marcus stood on the battlements, looking down at an army of vampires who had chosen tradition over change, fear over hope. At their head, Victoria Ashworth looked up at him with eyes full of cold determination. Marcus Blackwood. Victoria's voice carried clearly in the night air. You have one last chance to abandon this foolishness. Surrender now, execute the human witnesses, and return to the old ways. I might allow you to live as an exile rather than executing you for treason. Marcus stepped forward to the edge of the battlements. Victoria, I offer you the same choice. Join us in building something better. Help us show the world that vampires can be more than parasites and predators. Victoria's laughter was sharp and bitter. You want us to become servants to the humans we once ruled. You want us to give up centuries of power and dominion to become their lapdog protectors. Never. Then, we have nothing more to discuss, Marcus replied. The battle began at midnight, and it was unlike any conflict in vampire history. This was not just a war between different covens or political factions, it was a war between two completely different visions of what vampires could be. Victoria's forces attacked with the brutal efficiency of experienced predators. They were stronger, faster, and more numerous than Marcus's rebels. But they fought for preservation of the status quo, for maintaining power and dominion. Marcus's vampires fought for something entirely different. They fought alongside humans, protecting mortal allies who supplied them with weapons, medical care, and strategic support. They fought not to destroy their enemies but to prove that cooperation between species was possible. Elena and Isabella had been placed in the most secure part of the fortress, but the little girl kept insisting she needed to be in the Great Hall. The ceremony has to start now, she told Rebecca urgently. While the battle is happening. It's the only way to show everyone that change is really possible. Rebecca looked out at the fierce fighting raging in the courtyards below. Elena, we can't perform a mystical ceremony while we're in the middle of a war. But that's exactly when we need to do it, Elena insisted. Professor O'Brien, you know the words, right? The ritual to break the old covenant? The elderly vampire scholar nodded reluctantly. I've studied the texts for decades, but, Elena, we don't even know if it will work. And, if Marcus performs this ritual, he might die. If he doesn't perform it, we all might die, Elena replied with the wisdom of someone far older than her 8 years. Marcus, who had been fighting on the front lines, suddenly appeared in the great hall. His clothes were torn and bloodied, but his eyes blazed with determination. Elena's right. This is why we came here. Not just to fight a war, but to prove that transformation is possible. One by one, the vampires who had joined Marcus's cause began gathering in the great hall, even as the battle raged around them. Some were wounded, all were exhausted, but they came because they believed in the possibility of change. The humans came too, Isabella, Maria, the researchers and volunteers who had risked everything to support this impossible dream. They formed a circle in the center of the hall, vampires and humans alternating, their hands joined despite centuries of fear and mistrust. Professor O'Brien began reciting the ancient words, his voice echoing off the stone walls where vampire civilization had begun over 1,000 years earlier. The language was older than any modern tongue, a mixture of Latin and something far more primal. As he spoke, Marcus felt the weight of his immortal power beginning to shift. The supernatural strength that had defined him for 8 centuries started to flow out of him and into the circle of joined hands. But, instead of weakening him, the process filled him with a warmth and vitality he had forgotten existed. The vampires in the circle began to change. Their fangs retracted, their pale skin took on a healthier color, and their eyes lost the predatory gleam that had marked them as monsters. But they were still clearly more than human, there was a radiance about them, a sense of power channeled toward protection rather than predation. Outside, the battle was shifting. Victoria's forces, sensing the magical transformation taking place in the Great Hall, redoubled their attacks. But something extraordinary was happening to Marcus's defenders. The vampires who had not yet joined the ceremony found themselves fighting with renewed strength and purpose. The humans, no longer paralyzed by fear, fought alongside their supernatural allies with unprecedented courage. Elena, still holding hands with the vampires and humans in the circle, suddenly opened her eyes wide. Victoria's coming here. She's going to try to stop the ceremony. Before anyone could react, Victoria Ashworth burst into the Great Hall with a dozen of her most powerful allies. Her eyes blazed with fury as she saw the transformation ritual in progress. "You're destroying everything," she screamed at Marcus. "Thousands of years of vampire civilization, and you're throwing it away for these weak mortals." Marcus, his power nearly completely transferred, looked at Victoria with eyes that were no longer those of a vampire king but of a man who had found his humanity again. "I'm not destroying anything, Victoria. I'm completing what we were always meant to become." Victoria raised her hand, dark energy crackling around her fingers, preparing to strike down Marcus and shatter the ceremony. But, before she could attack, Elena stepped out of the circle. "Miss Victoria," the little girl said, her voice calm and unafraid. "I know you're scared. I can see it in your heart. You're afraid that if vampires change, you'll have to face all the terrible things you've done over the centuries." Victoria hesitated, thrown off balance by the child's words. "I am not afraid of anything." "Yes, you are. You're afraid that if you let yourself feel guilty about hurting people, the pain will be too much to bear. But it doesn't have to be that way." Elena walked toward Victoria, her small hand extended. "I've seen your future too, Miss Victoria. In some of my dreams, you join the circle. You let go of the anger and fear that's been eating at you for so long. And you become one of the strongest protectors humanity has ever known." For a moment, Victoria's expression wavered. Marcus could see the internal struggle, centuries of darkness warring against a spark of hope that Elena's words had ignited. But, then, Victoria's face hardened again. "No. I will not be weak. I will not serve humans who are nothing more than cattle." She raised her hand again, power gathering for a killing blow aimed at Elena. Marcus tried to move to protect the child, but his vampire speed was gone, his supernatural strength drained by the ceremony. But, before Victoria could strike, her own lieutenant stepped between her and Elena. It was James Morrison, a vampire Victoria had turned during the English Civil War and who had served her loyally for over 3 centuries. "Enough," James said quietly. "Victoria, I've followed you for 300 years. I've killed for you, conquered for you, believed in your vision of vampire superiority. But I will not watch you murder a child who offers nothing but love." Victoria stared at her oldest ally in shock. "James, you cannot be serious." "I am deadly serious. This child has shown more courage and wisdom in 8 years than we have in centuries of existence. If she can forgive vampires for all the harm we've done, perhaps we can forgive ourselves and choose a better path." James walked over to the circle and took the hand of a human woman, then extended his other hand to a vampire who had been hesitating on the sidelines. "I choose transformation." One by one, other vampires from Victoria's own forces began joining the circle. Some were young vampires who had never fully embraced the predatory lifestyle. Others were ancient vampires who, like James, were tired of centuries of darkness and cruelty. Victoria watched in growing horror as her army dissolved around her. "This is madness. You're all mad." Elena approached Victoria one more time, her small hand still extended in friendship. "It's not madness, Ms. Victoria. It's hope. And it's not too late for you." Victoria looked down at the child who had started this revolution simply by existing, simply by showing a vampire king that mercy was possible. For just a moment, Marcus thought he saw tears in Victoria's ancient eyes. But, then, she stepped back, shaking her head. "I cannot. I will not. If this is what vampires are becoming, then I choose to remain what we were." Victoria turned and walked out of the Great Hall, her remaining loyal followers trailing behind her. They would not fight anymore tonight, their army was broken, their cause abandoned by too many converts. The ceremony continued through the night. By dawn, over 400 vampires had chosen transformation, becoming something new, immortal guardians sustained by positive connection with humanity rather than feeding upon it. Marcus, now fully human again, watched with wonder as former monsters became protectors, predators became healers. Elena found him as the sun was rising, painting the ancient fortress in shades of gold and pink. "How do you feel, Mr. Marcus?" Marcus looked at his hands, no longer pale and cold but warm and living. He could feel his heartbeat, something he hadn't experienced in 8 centuries. "I feel alive. Truly alive for the first time in so long. Do you regret giving up your power?" Marcus knelt down to Elena's level and smiled. "Elena, I spent 800 years as a vampire king, ruling through fear and feeding on blood. I've been human again for only a few hours, and already I feel like I've accomplished more good than in all those centuries combined." Elena hugged him tightly. "And this is just the beginning. In my good dreams, the world becomes so much better now that vampires and humans can work together." "What about Victoria? In your visions, does she ever change?" Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "Some futures, yes. Some futures, no. But, now that so many vampires have chosen the new way, she can't stop the change from happening. Even if she never joins us, the world will still become better." As the weeks passed, news of the transformation spread throughout the supernatural world. The vampires who had undergone the ceremony began using their immortal lives and enhanced abilities to protect humanity. Some became doctors who could work tirelessly to save lives, others became rescuers who could reach disaster victims no human could save, still others became counselors and teachers who used centuries of experience to guide and heal. Marcus, now mortal but retaining the wisdom of his centuries, became an ambassador between the human and supernatural worlds. His sacrifice had not only transformed vampires but had proven to humanity that even monsters could choose redemption. Elena continued having visions, now helping to guide the integration of transformed vampires into human society. Her grandmother Isabella became the first human to serve on the new Council of Cooperation that governed vampire-human relations. 6 months after the battle in the Carpathian Mountains, Marcus received a letter. It was from Victoria Ashworth, written from somewhere in Antarctica where she had retreated with her few remaining traditional followers. "Marcus," the letter read, "you have won. The world you and that extraordinary child envisioned is becoming reality. Most vampires have chosen your path of cooperation over my path of domination. I write to inform you that my remaining followers and I will not interfere with your new world order. We will remain in isolation, neither helping nor hindering what you have built. Perhaps someday I will understand what you saw in that moment when you chose to save Elena Rodriguez. Perhaps someday I will have the courage to choose hope over fear as you did. But that day is not today. Know this, though, I respect what you accomplished, even if I cannot embrace it myself. You found a way to give our kind something I thought was impossible, redemption." Victoria Marcus showed the letter to Elena, who read it with the same serious expression she had worn throughout their incredible journey. "She'll come around eventually," Elena said confidently. "I still see those futures where she joins us. It might take another 100 years, but she'll get there." Marcus smiled and ruffled Elena's hair. "And what about us? What do your visions show for our future?" Elena grinned, looking like the normal 8-year-old she had never quite been able to be. "Good things, Mr. Marcus. Really, really good things. The world is going to be so much brighter now." As Marcus looked out at a world where vampires had become guardians, where centuries of fear were slowly being replaced by cooperation and trust, he knew that Elena was right. His betrayal of vampire Lot had cost him his immortality and his throne, but it had given him something far more valuable, the chance to help both vampires and humans become the best versions of themselves. The vampire king was gone, but the man who remained had found something worth more than any crown: redemption, love, and hope for a future where monsters and heroes were choices rather than destinies. And, in the end, that transformation was worth any price he could have paid.